Bam.
Hey, this is Colonel Andy Dziengeleski, and you're watching the Break It Down show.
Yes, you are. Yes, you are. I love whenever we have Jingles on the show. I get to call him Colonel Andy or Jingles. Also, about to be retired. Congratulations on a job damn well done.
I survived. That's what's important.
You did. You did survive. Hey, I want to open the show because today's Memorial Day. I wrote something earlier today. A lot of us veterans get a little bit high and mighty on Veterans Day and talking about it's a day of remembrance and it's not a holiday. And I say bullshit to that. We all have someone in our history, whether we're aware of it or not, that died during service. We all get to memorialize people how we want to. I mean, hey, Irish throw wakes. That's a different style than somebody else does something. What are your thoughts in general on Memorial Day and the appropriate way to remember those that have fallen for our freedom or in service of our freedom?
I think it's an individual thing. I'm not going to talk down on anybody and criticize or critique what they're doing for Memorial Day. If you want to go to a parade, that's fine. If you want to grill and have a barbecue, that's fine. I think as long as you remember, you the individual remember people. Especially with my generation, having the Iraq and Afghanistan wars. I mean, if you spent more than a few minutes in Iraq or Afghanistan, you probably know somebody who was wounded or was killed. And that's certainly the case with me.
Yep.
So it's just it's one of these things where I think it's a private endeavor, and I think whichever way you want to celebrate it is perfectly fine. I don't think this should be a day of solemnness. Like you said, the Irish threw a pretty mean wake. And I know a number of my friends would have liked to have a big old bash in their remembrance. So it's just whatever floats your boat. As long as you think about it and think about your friends or your comrades, then other than that, it's just another day.
All right, let's move on to the next topic. We can talk about that all day, but really, yeah, I tip my cap. You and I both have people we know personally that have passed on during or after service, and I'm glad we have this day for us all to individually spend time memorializing and remembering what that sacrifice looks like. Okay, dot. Period. Good job. The conversation I want to have with you is Russia and China. We often get all aflutter about Russia and China. I remember a couple years back, and I believe we've discussed this in the past. There was this image of a Russian tank on like a multi-parachuted flat, like a transportation pallet, right? And this is for the audience. It's like a giant square. Imagine a tank on this being dropped in, and it was like, oh my God, look at what the Russians are doing for it. Like, if you want to drop your tanks from the back of an airplane, like, good luck. That's such an interesting approach to things. But
the crazy thing about that is that the Russian BMD vehicle, which is their airborne tank,
yeah,
the tankers are actually inside the vehicle.
Good God!
No, seriously. It sounded like the 82nd when they used to have Sheridans, they would LARP their Sheridans in, and then the paratroopers would actually jump out of the plane and meet up with them. That's not the case with the old Soviet airborne and the Russian airborne now. They're actually in the BMDs going down with the vehicle.
You know as well as I do, when you drop stuff out of an airplane attached to parachutes, 10% right to the ground. Boop.
Yeah, and then when a tank augers in, it augers in deep.
All the way. Not something you walk away from.
Probably not.
We get a little twisted up about Russia and China. And yeah, China's got a 100-year plan. We don't think like that. Here's Russia pushing itself into Ukraine. And no matter what happens with that conflict, we are seeing that they're willing to get into a fight, right? So I wanted to kind of back up on some of this stuff and talk a little bit about what we've learned with the Russian and conflict and how China and how Russia maybe look in the future and how you see these things. And also, I think importantly, how does culture of a force, of a people, impact their ability to deploy and impose will and create a victory?
No, I think that's a good way to approach it is, look at it from the organizational culture perspective, and then we can draw all the way down into tactical stuff. And you take a look at like the American military organizational culture, and we'll call it service culture, right? Because that's what it really is. The definitive book on this, by the way, is a guy named Carl Bilder in 1989, and wrote this fantastic book called The Mask Civil War. And he looked at each service's organizational culture and how that led to, how you organize, how you man, how you trained, how you equipped. And the thing that's interesting about it is a lot of this hasn't changed. Like what Builder says about the United States Army is that the United States Army's culture was built and solidified in Northwestern Europe in 1944 and 1945. And if you take a look at how the Army is redesigning itself today, going back to a division-based force, armor heavy, it's just Back to the Future, right? You have your airborne mafia, but they also were involved in Northwest Europe, Market Garden, Normandy, crossing the Remagen. When you take a look at the Air Force, the Air Force has been created, and it really is a myth. My Air Force friends are going to pound me for that, but it's true. Strategic bombing. So the Air Force's culture has always been determined by fighters and the fighter mafia and bombers, and that's it. Everything else is kind of ancillary to it. Mm. And Builder actually writes another book in the early 90s called The Icarus Syndrome, which looks specifically at the Air Force culture and why it's kind of eroding. And agree with him or not, what he basically says is that because the lack of air-to-air combat, right? Because you're really just flying strike missions for the most part, because we crush our adversaries so quickly with our fighters, and the lack of huge bomber fleets, that culture is starting to change. And then you can add stuff like ICBMs into the mix, add stuff like space into the mix, add stuff like cyber into the mix, and all of a sudden the Air Force culture of the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s now starts to change in the 90s. Mm-hmm. And is that a good thing? Is it a bad thing? We don't know. It's just changing. And now you add things like drones, which is really going to change the culture, right? When you don't have fighter pilots anymore, when you don't have bomber pilots anymore, when you don't have attack helicopter pilots anymore, or scout pilots. So that's going to change it. And then the Navy, the Navy really has 3 or 4 subcultures. You've got the submariners, and they're split, right? You have the attack subs and the boomer subs. You've got surface warfare, and then you have aircraft carriers, and then the fighters on top of them. So from the American perspective, it kind of sort of looks like what we were doing in World War II. I mean, the Marines is all light infantry, right? Now, you take a look at that, and you compare it to, say, the Russians. Well, the Russians have always been an artillery-heavy army, right? And there's reasons for that. Artillery, especially tube artillery, is very simple to operate. If you have a 6 or 7 person gun crew, you only need a couple guys to actually have a minor education, right? Because, you have dude pulls rope, gun bang. You have dude picks up shell, shovels it into the gun, arms the gun, right? I mean, and you have a guy, with a big wheel elevating or depressing the gun, right? So those are fairly easy things. The Russians are interesting with their culture because, when you take a look at the VDV, which is their airborne air assault troops, they're shock troops. They're psychological warfare troops, basically. They go in, they seize an area, and they basically say, come get us. And 9 times out of 10, nobody comes and gets them. Well, the problem is when somebody does get them, and we saw this at the airport in Kiev, they've shown that they're actually pretty vulnerable, which is the case for airborne troops in general, right? If you can surround them or you can deny them their objectives, they're relying on resupply within 72 to 96 hours. Now, the Russian strategic culture, and when I mean strategic, I'm really talking about their nuclear forces. That's a whole different game. Like that's what you have to worry about with the Russians, because they do have a huge ICBM fleet, they do have boomers, and they do have bombers. Although they're ancient for the most part, they have some blackjacks that are built in the late 70s, early 80s that are more modern. But the culture of the army, specifically in Russia, is really bad. Like there's a guy named Kamil Galeev who's written quite a bit about this on Twitter. And the army is seen as the absolute bottom of all the services in Russia. Like you getting drafted in the army is like the equivalent of being drafted in Vietnam or the American Civil War. You had options to get out of it, right? either medical discharge, or in the case of the Civil War, you paid somebody, or in Vietnam, you went to college. So the people who ended up getting drafted are really looked upon as being scorned in Russia, and they're either poor, backwards, or both. And, it was interesting. I was reading one of his threads last night, and what the Russian army has done is this is an amazing statistic. 23% of the brigade commanders and higher in the Russian army have no military experience. Not combat experience, military experience. And what happens is that they're placed there by Putin out of the intel services to ensure loyalty to the state, right? So that's really interesting. The other thing that's really interesting is the people who are dying in Ukraine for Russia aren't Russian. 85% of the casualties in Ukraine come from two major places: South Siberia, they're Buddhist or even animist people, and Caucasian Muslims, specifically Dagestanis. So the Russians are avoiding all of this. They're not putting actual Russian people, and the people who are being sent in who are Russian, again, are from very rural areas who didn't have a way to get out of the draft. And then it's a conscript force, for the most part. Over the last couple of weeks, what's been interesting is they've been building new laws and policies to expand the population of who's eligible to get drafted. It used to be 30, now it's 40, right? So that's a manpower problem, because the casualties, they can't replace their casualties in Ukraine. So got to expand the pool. Who wants to join? Well, they're expanding benefits, they're expanding pay. So they're putting these things in place that are desperate because they are desperate. And then a couple other things that are really interesting about the Russians are the Russian NCO Corps, traditionally going way back into the Soviet period, has always been very brutal. Hazing has always been very, very bad, like very physical, robbery, corruption. And this is towards their own people, by the way. Right? This is towards the conscripts. And the other thing that's interesting is, I've had some people ask me about the role of the Chechens. The Chechens are nothing but basically very brutal police. The Chechens aren't doing any fighting. They go in afterwards and basically just suppress any sort of, or try to suppress any sort of insurgency or counterinsurgency that's going to occur afterwards. So the Chechens actually aren't doing much fighting right now. And in general, with the Russians, the intel agencies and the nuclear forces are the ones they get the best people, right? It makes sense. You want loyalty to the state, and the things that blow up the world, you want to have smart people, and you don't want lunatics running your nuclear submarines.
So, okay, does this, in terms of a force structure, I mean, how much of our own American bias is in this? And let me expand this a little bit. When we go out as a force and we encounter and try to teach and train other forces that have been, the Russians got there before us, you see this plain as day. The NCO force is completely neutered. I mean, don't really know why they even call them NCOs. And here's when our culture is bad. Our sergeant majors are like, we must build an NCO academy. Like, well, okay, yeah, let's do that. However, let's not expect these guys to actually treat this thing as an actual core that is going to lead on the ground level. And the other thing is you also see that the command is always looking upwards to make sure that they cover their ass, because they don't have trust as you get lower. And so you won't see a lieutenant, or you might see a lieutenant maybe stick his neck out a little bit, but you won't see a captain, a major, or a colonel in whatever force, that we're at. And obviously I'm talking rank equivalent here. You won't see them stick their necks out because the guy above them or two ranks above them, they just don't have that top-down authority. And we struggle with this ourselves, by the way. So talk a little bit about that aspect of the culture in most of the forces that are, Russian in nature.
Yeah, so the Russians and the Chinese are actually very similar this way because they have their communist backgrounds. Actually, that's one of the surprising things about the Ukrainians, is that the Ukrainians have been able, I think, from what I've been able to see, and again, this has been very tightly controlled, what we've actually been able to see, but it looks like the Ukrainians have been able to be a lot more flexible, with a lot more initiative at lower levels. When you take a look at the Russians and you take a look at the Chinese, NCOs are not, the NCO Corps is not given a lot of authority. It's given almost zero initiative. They have very little influence into decision making, right? They basically herd people, right? A lot of this has to do with the tension between the state and the military in these cases, right? Because if you're a dictator or an autocrat, whatever you want to call it,
Right.
You want to have the army on your side. So what we've seen, like within China, in like 14, 15, 16, there were a bunch of reforms in China to ensure that the Communist Party, the CCP, basically had much greater control over the army, specifically People's Liberation Army. It's the same thing in Russia, right? That's why you have all these intel officers masquerading as brigade and division commanders and army commanders, is because they have to control the state. And if you don't have control of your army when things go bad, like they've gone for the Russians, that army now can be seen as a threat towards your regime.
Right.
Right. And it's all about that autocratic rule, which is very interesting because, we don't experience this. But, your point about, looking at countries where maybe there were Soviet advisors and then we came in afterwards is very interesting, because where they were advising the most was in Africa and the Middle East. A little bit in Asia, but that was not much. Mostly Africa and the Middle East. And guess what they were dealing with there? The exact same kind of government, right? So it was easy for them to go in and advise. And if you have, an army who's consistent of poorly educated, poorly fed, poorly disciplined troops, it's pretty easy to go in there and be a decent trainer, because your expectations aren't that high. If I can feed these guys, clothe these guys, get them to march in a line, teach them how to shoot a rifle, teach them how to shoot an RPG. It's kind of what they were doing already. What we're trying to do when we do advisory missions, I think may be a bridge too far, because we set our expectations up here. Hey, they have to look like us, they have to be like us, they have to act like us. No. You can't do it that way. You have to get, the phrase in Afghanistan was Afghan good enough.
Yeah.
Right. There's a certain level that they're just going to top out at, and you just got to accept that. And that's hard for people to understand. This is something that's interesting too. Like with the Chinese, up until 2016, like most of the conscripts in the PLA had a 9th grade or lower education. Okay, so what are they actually going to be able to do? Are they going to be able to do simple soldier tasks? Probably. Are they going to be able to, become mechanics on jet engines? Unlikely. Right? You can put them through schooling if they want to stay that long, but if they're if you have 30% or 40% of your force as conscripts, what are those things that conscripts can do? They can do artillery. They can be artillerymen. They can be infantrymen. Maybe tankers, combat engineers, sappers. They can drive trucks. There's very few things that conscripts can do, and that's what the Chinese are fighting about right now internally, is how do we want to modernize our force, right? And we got all this GWIS equipment, most of it's been stolen from the West, and they built it there. But now you have this huge problem because you have an uneducated force who can't actually maintain this stuff. And by the way, it's the opposite for us. Our stuff's getting so complex that it's hard to teach, one-term soldiers and Marines to actually maintain it. Like the first Stryker Brigade, I think I mentioned this to you before, the first Stryker Brigade that went to Iraq, 500 General Dynamics maintenance folk had to go over with them.
That's right.
So
that's just that one weapon system. That's not
right.
All of them. Yeah.
Right. So it's interesting to see, the seesaw here. We're getting really complex. They want to become more complex. They don't have the education levels in their citizenry to necessarily do that. Right. And again, some of these reforms are they're only 5 years old. I mean, they just started doing serious. The Chinese, for example, have only been doing serious joint education since 2016. right? That's only 6 years. Do you expect them to be world beaters? Absolutely not.
Right.
So and that gets to this whole thing of, well, the Chinese can do this, the Chinese can do that. Pump the brakes. Look at the quality of their force. Same thing with the Russians. Look at the quality of their force. Understand their culture. Understand how they train, how they fight. Are NCOs being used like they are in the West, where they're really coaches and teachers and mentors? I learned how to shoot a rifle from a sergeant first class when I was an ROTC cadet. I never picked up a rifle before I joined ROTC.
Yeah, right.
Backwoods guy from West Virginia. I mean, he was a squirrel hunter. Couldn't learn from a better guy how to shoot a rifle, right?
Yeah. Not to mention our warrant officers, when they're used properly, and they actually are technicians, boy, they know things and they can advise. They fill that gap between command and NCOs really well, and you can really bridge that strategic tactical gap with those guys. And I don't know how well the other forces use those.
Well, and the thing that's interesting, Pete, you're absolutely right. And I think, between, I was thinking about this last night. When you take a look at the Russian difficulties in maintenance and transportation and logistics in general, and you take a look at the way we are able to do power projection across the world, I started thinking about that, and I'm like, well, let's see. We're the country that really invented the automotive industry. And as a part of that, we invented mass production. And as a part of that, you have this culture, civilian culture that's been car-based, automobile-based, and truck-based for going on 100 years. You can take a kid out of Missouri or Arizona or upstate New York, and they probably know how to mess with an engine, right? They probably know how to mess with keeping their equipment up and running. And that's why the warrant officers are so critical too, right? And what that allows you, and this is the critical aspect of this, what that allows you is to maintain continuity of operations over time, right? Because if you don't have that capability and your equipment's getting destroyed or broken, and you don't have that capability, and actually the Army, I'll give the Army credit here because I was part of this. About 2012, a number of us in DC at the lieutenant colonel level started talking to some seniors in the Pentagon. It's like, we have to learn how to reconstitute our forces again, right? Because the last time we took serious casualties was in Vietnam. So what happens when, you've lost a company out of a battalion? What happens when you lose a battalion out of a brigade? What happens when you lose a brigade out of a division? How do you get that equipment off the battlefield into repair shops, get it fixed quickly, and then how do you replenish combat losses? And I'll give you an example that's the most extreme example I heard of over the entire 20 years of the GWAT. It was either 1-5 Marines or 3-5 Marines. When they went into Sangin down in Helmand Province in 2009, they walked into a buzzsaw, and they were facing, well-trained Taliban at the company-size level. I forgot what battalion it was, either 1-5 or 3-5. They lost so many Marines that they exhausted not only the in Afghanistan personnel replacement supply, not only the CENTCOM replacement supply, they had to go back to Camp Lejeune and bring Marines in from the United States. Okay, that's an amazing thing.
Right.
And they did it quickly. Right, you're talking about a week, maybe two. That's what skilled personnelists, skilled logisticians, skilled warrant officers, skilled NCOs bring to the table. Keep the fight going over time and space. And that's a critical aspect of what the Russians are finding out right now. Now, the Russians are leaders in a couple of things, okay? We can't say, the Russians are buffoons. The Russians are world leaders in using railroad troops and railroads to resupply. Why? Number one, Russia has more railroads than it does roads.
Right.
Number two, they're fighting on their periphery, right? Ukraine, Georgia, the Caucasus, all the places where the Russians have fought, you can get there by rail. So they're not really projecting power. They've got those, what Jomini said, those interior lines of communication, right? So it's a lot easier for them to resupply. Now, the quality of their resupply is a whole nother matter. They've got huge problems with duds. They've got huge problems with keeping stuff. Trent Zelenko on Twitter has been awesome. He's a retired civil servant who worked in the Army for something like 25, 30 years. And he was the first guy who brought up the tire problem at the Russian trucks, where, hey, it looks like these tires have been out in the sun. If you leave them out there for like a year, they're going to turn into dust, basically. And that's exactly what's happened. So it goes back to this culture issue, right? Of the Russians don't have a culture of logistics. They don't have a culture of sustainment. And the reason why is they're not projecting power. They don't have their forces, as an armor officer, it's like you live when you weren't out shooting your tank, you were out maintaining it in the motor pool, right? So you don't have that culture of maintenance, and you don't have that culture of transportation and that understanding of how do I keep at the operational strategic level, how do I keep my forces supplied in the field? And that's really what's damaging the Russians right now.
What are the differences when we talk about these things? Like, I'll just use myself as an example. Because I stayed and I really operated at the company and below level or on the colonel's personal details, so I could go where I wanted, wherever the colonel wanted. The colonel would often say, hey, where do you want to go today? Take me to wherever you want to go. So I had that kind of access. I got that access because I had been on the ground more than anybody else. Multiple battalions in a row, same area, different areas, same program, still worked. And that colonel was able to say, this guy's an absolute expert. I wasn't even in the Army at this point. I was a DA civilian. So I was working with the Army or in some form or not. But that colonel, those captains, they were able to say, hey, I'm going to put Pete to work because he understands this stuff. Like, I've just seen it more than everybody else, right? You come as a company commander, not only about half my age, I've got, more, you could line up the amount of guys it would take to cover my combat time specifically, and understanding these things. So you have, and I'm not the only guy like this. There's all kinds of people that are specific experts that have tremendous capability. So much so that battalion commander, in this case, he tells the hire, they're reading reports and they're like, hey, we're going to send you a PSYOPs team to run the radio out there in this distant district. And he said, no, thanks. And then the boss is like, no, you're going to take them. They're coming out. And he's like, I'm going to send them right back. Right. And then so ultimately the general backs off of the colonel because, he's like, okay, you're saying you've got this covered. I'm going to leave you alone. And he left us alone. That wouldn't happen in a lot of other militaries. We have some knucklehead civilian advising a colonel who has the balls to tell a general not only no once, but no enough times. He's like, oh, all right, I changed my mind then.
Well, right. And it comes down to a number of aspects here, right? It's trust, not trust on a personal level, but trust and expertise.
Right.
I can trust you because you've been here longer, the subject longer, you've accomplished things. What's interesting, like with the Chinese NCO Corps, they don't leave the same. They never leave their unit. Right. And they're only allowed to go up to the squad level, leader level. Our NCOs, they go everywhere. Right. If you do 20 years in the Army, as an NCO, you're going to do TRADOC assignments. You're going to do force comm assignments. You're probably going to go overseas in Korea, Germany, deploy. And you're going to have different assignments across the entire spectrum of the Army. Not like that in most other countries, And then, again, it goes back to we value our NCOs. We give them and allow them to have a voice, right? When I was a platoon leader, I relied on my platoon sergeant. When I was a company commander, I relied on my first sergeant. If I had taken command of the RISA squadron, I was slated to command, I would have listened to my sergeant major, right? So that's how it works, right? Is if you let people have a voice and you trust them, and you have a system that values trust, you build unit cohesion, you build expertise, you build esprit de corps, then all of a sudden, you got a really powerful unit because one of the things that I used to do as a platoon leader was just, every quarter I'd sit down with the PFCs and specialists for a couple hours. Hey, what's going good? What's not going good? What's bad? What can we do better? And just get feedback, right? It's that establishment of feedback loops. And when you have a closed system, like a lot of these autocratic countries do, and they don't listen to they don't allow their NCOs to have a voice. They don't allow that. their junior officers to have a voice and have any influence at all, that's a closed system, which means it's going to die. Right. And that's the value of our system, is that, yeah, people get mauled. I mean, like not physically mauled, but hey, you do something wrong, you're going to get chewed out. But at the same point in time, we're going to allow you to put your neck out on the line. Hey, if you believe something so strongly and you can explain this to me logically, maybe this is what we should do. And that goes to flexibility in your leadership.
One of the things that's interesting about Russia is physically, it's, like you said, the biggest country in the world. And that means you have a lot of things on your border and a lot of things internally that require attention. And I wonder, so the countries that are peers in terms of population size are places like, Mexico, Japan, Ethiopia, just like they have it's called 110 to 150,000 or 150 million people. And I would submit that geography creates problems for these countries. You don't envision the Philippines invading anybody. You don't maybe Japan because they've got a history of it, but you're also talking about a totally different culture. It's an island, right? Islands versus a giant landmass. How much do you think geography plays into this? And why does it seem that the populations from about 110 to 150 million, they don't smack as being like, oh yeah, they're a military power. If they come to your country, you're going to be in a lot of trouble. And maybe 3 months ago, that would have been the case with Russia, but there's just not that many people there. And there's a lot of internal problems.
Well, that's a really broad question to tackle.
Yeah, it is.
I mean, a lot of it has to do with the societal culture, right? Now you look at Germany for 3 centuries. The Germans weren't that big of a country. They've been run over by the French. They've been run over by the Russians. They've been run over by the Swedes. They've been run over by the Austrians. Yeah. So there's a martial culture to the society that takes place. The Prussian. Everybody, the stereotypical Prussian aspect of the German army, which was only a very small part of it. So that matters. If you don't have a history, Mexico doesn't have this great military history, right?
Right.
It's like they fought against the United States a few times. They fought against the French once, which was completely insane. And, a lot of it's just basically internal control or lack thereof at this point.
Right.
With the Russians, the Russians it's a really complicated country. It's 6,000 miles long. You've got something ridiculous like 230 or 240 different languages that are spoken in Russia.
Crazy.
One of the most interesting pictures I've seen out of the war in Ukraine was a Siberian individual who was getting blessed by a Buddhist priest before going into battle on the Russian side.
Wow.
It's like, I was not expecting that.
Yeah.
It was just something to show how strange all this is. And again, it comes back to what's the role of the army in your society? What's the role of the military in your society?
Yeah.
A lot of these smaller countries, and some of the big ones too, the military, especially like China, right? The military is there for internal control. Right? It's 1.3 billion people. You need a military for internal control. Same thing when you get into a lot of these more autocratic states. It's there for internal control and to ensure political viability and survivability. And that's why you pick cronies, because they're politically reliable. That's what it comes down to. So geography is a huge problem with Russia. For God's sake, it's the coldest country in the world. You go up to Yakutsk, I think the name of the city is, and you get down to minus 80 Fahrenheit.
Yeah.
And you got huge river systems. You got the Ural Mountains. You got the Caucasus Mountains. There's another mountain range. You got Lake Baikal, which is the world's largest freshwater lake. It's like 6,000 feet deep. It's got its own seal population. That's crazy. The Russian Far East, nobody even thinks about the Russian Far East, Vladivostok and the Kamchatka Peninsula, that's a whole different story. For God's sake, you have tigers out there, right? Siberian tigers. It's a really huge country. And what's interesting is, over the long term is how Russia is going to be able to actually control control what they have. With bad demographics, you've got declining population, your birth rates are terrible, your men die early, and oh, by the way, you got 1.3 billion Chinese who are slowly taking over the border towns. I mean, they don't have to fight. The Chinese don't have to fight. They're just going to take over the towns and breed them out of existence. So this is going to be very complex. But yeah, it's a very hard question to answer. You can go a lot of different ways with it.
Yeah. Geography does matter. I mean, like you think about. I'm reading this great book by a guy named Buddy Levy, and it's about polar explorers from the early 1900s. And these guys get beset by ice, and they have to get off their ship because the ship gets crushed. It's just like the Shackleton expedition that had happened like 5 years before, but down south, right? Matter of fact, 2 of the guys from the Shackleton expedition go on this expedition, and they end up on Wrangel Island and over in Kamchatka, and they literally walked to the rescue team. Literally walks to Nome. Like across ice floes and dog sleds and all this kind of stuff. And it's that hard to survive out there, where surviving is half of what you do every day, and then the rest of it is like comfort, leisure, chores, whatever else. It is it's dramatically different.
Well, just to give you an idea about the Russians, right? So going back to this, we'll go back to the Soviet Union, right? So in order to provide this incredible, glorious communist society, you actually had to produce stuff for your people. So what's one of the major problems with Russia? Well, it's freezing most of the time because of the latitude.
Right.
So what they do is, I believe this starts in the late 1940s and 1950s, down in like around the Aral Sea. So all the rivers that feed the Aral Sea, they start building these huge canal complexes, diverting water in order to grow cotton. Right? Because it's warm enough down there to grow cotton. Well, guess what happens now? 60 years later. The Aral Sea is basically dead. If you take a look at the size of the Aral Sea today to what it was 50, 60 years ago, it's like 1/10 the size of the Ash
puddle. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly right. So you get these crazy, communist schemes. We're guilty of it too. I mean, again, we seriously consider using nuclear weapons to form a canal between San Diego and the Gulf of Mexico in the 1950s. We didn't do it, but it was seriously considered for a while. So it's just things like that. You get these really, and again, I think this is some of this autocratic thinking, is like these autocratic regimes have these grandiose, society-wide changing plans, and then you don't think about the second and third order consequences. It's like, what happens if we divert all the water into these deserts? Well, yeah, we can grow stuff, but you have this gigantic basin now that's literally lifeless because of, you got a 40-foot salt deposit on the bottom of the seabed now.
Right. An unfixable problem, right? The other thing I wanted to ask about, and let's transition, because China is a big piece of this, China. And so one of the things, and I guess let me cover this first, because we can go into China after this. We also practice, and to the PhD level and beyond, combined and joint operations. I don't even know what kind of coalition Russia could form, especially these days. I mean, okay, there's Belarus, but I mean, okay, well, you guys basically the same thing. Like, how can you? One of the reasons why we won, if you read Victor Davis Hansen's history of World War II, one of the reasons why we won is our interoperability, right? And so we were low on power in some of our airplanes. The English are like, we have this Merlin engine. You can stick it in your fantastic, the frame of your Hellcat or whatever. And all of a sudden you're like, oh my God, this thing is there's synergy in this, right?
Yeah.
So the combined and joint nature of how we fight, one, poses a tremendous problem for China and for Russia, but also that ability to have interoperability and the trust to like, hey, yeah, we're going to take your engines and assemble, whatever it's going to be, we can do that and create a better force.
Yeah, I mean, the Russians, they've already asked, Uzbekistan for troops. Uzbekistan's declined. They've asked, I think, Tajikistan for troops. The Tajiks have declined. So you're right. So what it comes down to is like, okay, you might be able to get a division out of Belarus, and then what?
Yeah,
because they're this is the one of the major strategic errors of this campaign is that they from the start, just invading, the simple fact of invading Ukraine, it isolated 90% of the world. from the Russian side. And then all of a sudden it's like, well, things are going bad. And it's like the Chinese are starting to back off. It's like, well, we're not going to help you out too much either. And then you look at what's left and it's not much. And what they have is like, it's not, okay, great. Those countries might be energy rich, but that's all they are.
Right.
And when they're unwilling to support you with manpower, then you got a world of hurt.
Especially when they're starting to make news that a Russian colonel has died because the generals have already been kind of killed off. So I want to get into China then. So as China sees this fight, obviously Russia is one of their main provider of weapons. China is also deeply tied to us financially and getting more so, it seems like, every day. How do you see China and their ability to, like, just a few months ago, right? The Marines, who specialized in landing Marines on a beach, killed a bunch of Marines trying to do that very same thing in a training exercise in a vehicle designed to do that exact thing. Yeah. So bring in the Taiwan part of the conversation too.
Yeah, so I actually wrote about this on my Medium channel. I think that the Chinese are taking a very long, hard look at themselves right now, and they realize a number of things. Number one, they don't have a good NCO corps; it's very restricted. And what they can do. They're not well educated for the most part. They're trying, again, they're reforming and they're trying to do this stuff, but it's taking time. Like, right. It's not going to be years. You got to measure this stuff in decades. You have, most of China's weaponry is Russian in design. It's changing now over time, right? Because all the industrial espionage. But it doesn't mean they actually know how to use it, right? And so when you take a look at China and Taiwan, the number one problem is it's 81 miles at its shortest point from the mainland to Taiwan.
Yeah.
And when we, with a few exceptions in World War II, mostly in the Pacific, when we launched an amphibious invasion, we had naval superiority, both subsurface and surface, and we had aerial superiority. Can the Chinese establish air superiority, subsurface superiority, and surface superiority before they launch their force? And here's the problem. There's no way they're going to be able to do that simultaneously, right? You're not going to be able to drop warheads on foreheads while your amphibious force is steaming across the Straits of Taiwan. They're nowhere near that well trained,
right?
Capable, right? And then as soon as that first bomb falls on Taiwan, it's going to instantly bring a coalition of American allies, America itself, both in Asia and in Europe, into the mix, right? And so, the Chinese have already pissed off the South Koreans to a large extent. They've already pissed off the Japanese to a large extent. They pissed off the Vietnamese to a large extent. They pissed off the Australians to a large extent. And those are really the four countries, and the Indians, by the way. There's a low-level war going up in the Himalayas again between the Indians and the Chinese.
Right.
And so, if they're going to do something with Taiwan, and they have to be looking at what's going on in Ukraine and looking at the weaponry, right? When Western powers can manufacture such lethal anti-tank and anti-aircraft munitions, I think a Stinger's really cheap.
Yeah.
I think it's less than $50,000.
It's all cheaper than a tank.
Right. But I mean, and that's the thing, to your point about the Marines who died off of California, I think it was last year doing training when their ancient amphibious vehicles sank. It's how survivable are these things?
Yeah.
Right. Because at a certain point, this is the age old, ever since 1915 in Cambrai, when the first tanks were introduced, you have armor versus weaponry, right? And when you get into the amphibious stuff, it's really complicated because you can't have much armor to begin with, because guess what? It has to float.
Yeah.
It has to be propelled across water, right? So you can have some armor, but it's probably only going to be, small arms effective, unless you do something really radical, and super expensive. Like you start using carbon fiber, Kevlar, titanium, and then then it's just not feasible because it costs too much to build one of these things.
And it's got to go on land and break shit. Like
right, and it's got to be maintained.
Yeah.
Right, and you have to have a crew that actually knows how to use it. Right, which means those crews have to be together for a substantial amount of time. So yeah, I mean, and that's why I wrote my piece on my Medium pages. The Chinese, if they were smart, and they are smart, they should be sitting back and just watching right now and seeing all the mistakes that the Ukrainians are making, watching all the mistakes that the Russians are making, and then that's the easy part, right? Then wait for this to actually stop, come to some sort of political solution, and then start reforming their own forces.
Mm-hmm.
Right, and that's going to take decades. Now, here's one thing that's interesting about the Chinese army in particular. The last war they fought was in 1979 against Vietnam, and the Vietnamese bloodied them badly. They took 40,000 casualties in about 6 months, and the Vietnamese only used one regular division. They had 9 militia divisions. When I went to Vietnam with my National War College class, the Vietnamese generals told us about that, and they were very proud of it. Like, we didn't even use our best units. They were pulled back to defend Hanoi and Haiphong, right? So the last veterans of that war were promoted to 4-star general this year.
Oh, boy. That is a long time ago. That is longer ago than I graduated college 30 years ago.
Right. I graduated in 96 from college, 26 years, right? So they have that, which is a problem, and then they have another huge problem, which I think is even bigger than that. It's the one-child policy.
Oh boy, yeah.
Right? So for every Chinese soldier, Marine, sailor, airman that gets killed, that's an entire family that's lost not just their son, but they've lost their bloodline.
Right.
That's important over there. Right? The names are important. So it was interesting. I was reading something a couple of weeks ago. Dr. Conrad Crane up at the Army War College had a piece where he bumped into some drunken Chinese general a couple of years ago, and the Chinese general basically said, we know the one-child policy is really problematic for us, and it's probably going to preclude us from going to large-scale conventional war. But here's the other thing, Pete. If I was the Chinese, I absolutely positively, if I need to get combat experience, the last place in the world I would do it is against Taiwan.
Yeah,
it's too complex of an operation, and if you lose that politically, then what?
One of the things too, like it's easy to say we can do this, right? Like, so 81 feet or 81 miles, that is forever on the water. I mean, you're not going to go, but maybe, I mean, you think you're going to go 100 miles.
15 miles an hour, maybe.
Yeah, maybe, right? And if there's an inkling that this thing's getting serious and close, I mean, look, if Pete's president, hey, here comes a carrier group, you're going to have to deal with it. The one thing that's great about our carrier groups is it shows up. Not a fucking thing you can do about it. Like it's just going to stay. And all the resources, all of the intel, all of it comes. The submarines come, and they all know that. So they'd have to do some kind of surprise attack. And by the way, if you pick the closest point, I promise there's a lot of work making that a nasty way to go, because
that's right. That's right. And like you said, okay, if I had to have let's pick a nice round number, 250,000 troop amphibious invasion force.
Right.
You're not going to hide that.
No.
With our sensors, you're not going to hide that from our satellites. You're not going to hide that from our listening devices. You're not going to hide that from our cameras.
Right.
Right. So you're not going to get any measure of surprise here. So again, all these things come into play, and it's like, and that's why I think the Chinese recognize this, which is why they're doing other things. Right. They're going into Africa. They're going into places like the Solomon Islands and trying to foster economic deals to gain leverage. And then, actually there was an article this morning about how somebody believes that right? The expert believes that the Chinese now want to expand their foreign basing in the Pacific. Okay. Good luck with that.
Yeah.
Good luck having, let's say 2,500 PLAs, having a regiment. Let's just say that you have a regiment of PLA soldiers on a Pacific island. Let me know how well that goes for you.
Yeah.
I mean, this is, people don't understand how backwards the PLA actually is. In 2002, they launched a press release that said all of our soldiers now have heating, air conditioning, and water in their barracks year round. That's only 20 years ago.
It's hilarious. And even that, I mean, look, I've seen the difference between American provided life support for Americans and then what we give to the contract companies who bring in their guys from other countries. And no one would ever pick theirs over ours, right? And so what level of heating, HVAC and water and sewer is provided is even then like, look, here's the thing. Joe, Army Joe, right? The center guy. He's like, I don't know what happened. I turned the hot water on and the whole damn thing came off in my hand,
Right.
So, and these are folks that are like relatively well-built things. That stuff is hyper expensive to have people out there constantly fixing. And
oh, sure.
We had a fire marshal come through our brigade headquarters, all built out of wood and everything in the middle of the desert in Iraq. And he said every single fluorescent light bulb or light fixture in this room doesn't have a quarter inch air gap underneath it. Every single light has to be taken down and re-put up, reinstalled. And it's had hundreds of lights,
Yeah.
And so we go to that level. It was ridiculous. But the entire brigade stopped operations until we had that fixed because everybody had to hurry up and get this done. And it wasn't long, but it was a lot of man hours that went into that. I guarantee you the Chinese doesn't do that. They just burn the fucking thing down.
Yeah, right. I mean, it's interesting. It's interesting you bring up that example. Telenko had a really interesting feed a few weeks ago about anti-tank missiles.
Uh-huh.
And if you take a look at how our anti-tank missiles are stored compared to what they were stored in Desert Storm. So he tells a story about like the 82nd goes over and they've got, 14 quadrillion TOW missiles.
Right.
But they're boxed up in wooden boxes with like sawdust and, shredded wood. And the logisticians keep telling them, look, you need 6 inches between each box.
Yeah.
Well, guess what doesn't happen? 6 inches between each box. So most of the missiles are defective, right? Because there's condensation that builds up. I mean, you know how humid it gets on the Persian Gulf.
Oh, boy.
And the missiles go bad. So what they did afterwards, you're like, we need to build a better mousetrap. So if you take a look at the modern boxes that missiles are stored in, they're plastic. The missiles are stored in foam. And on the outside of the boxes, there's flanges that come out about 6 inches, which do 2 things. Number one, it's easier to lift. And number two, you can't stack them that close. And then Telenko has these pictures from Ukraine showing Russian, Kornet anti-tank missiles, which are very good when they work. But they've been abandoned because they're all in the old packaging that we used 30 years ago. So again, that's we take one of the beauties of our military, and this goes all the way back, into the 1800s. A lot of the civilian applications and expertise gets brought into the military. It's why we send officers to graduate school, right? It's why we contract with these large companies because they can figure out ways to solve problems probably cheaper, faster, more effective than we could in the military.
Yeah.
Right? Does that happen? No, not in China.
Yeah.
One of the huge problems that China. One of the things that Xi did in 2016 is that he had this huge anti-corruption program, and that was used as the cover to reform the Chinese military. And there were probably at least a dozen generals that got sacked because these generals, what they would do is that they would accept bribes for promotions, but they would also run factories, right? And so the factories that produce weapons or equipment, they would have the control of that, and they were skimming off the top.
Yeah.
Is that still happening? Most likely. But if, there's this level of political fealty, that has to be built into everything that goes on with China, right? You have to be, and they say this in all their documents, by the way, we have to have politically reliable officer corps. from the second lieutenant all the way up through, and they actually have different tracks, right? They have like 5 different tracks in the PLA. It's like you can go on a command track, you can go on a political track, you can go on a staff track, you can go on I forgot what it's called, but it's kind of like an R&D expert, and then you can go on a logistics track, right? And so, but it doesn't matter because the political rules over them all,
right?
And it's just, you don't really have to worry too much about that here, and that's not true with a lot of places.
We've talked about this in the past, but I think I know it bears repeating because it's just remarkable when you think about the middle class in China is exploding, and it's already larger than our entire population.
Yeah.
And they want things like air conditioning, they want lattes, and they want all the things that everybody else has. So there is this exploding capitalist focus, like we need these things because we have money now, right? And to provide that requires a tremendous amount of capacity from Xi and the government in general. And if you don't provide it, well, good luck, because and so when you think about the things they want to take on, problems and everything, I just can't imagine that Taiwan is top of the heap. You're talking about, what city was it might break away? We're talking about parts of China breaking away at this point, right? And not now, maybe not in 10 years, but
look what you have going on right now, right? You got Xinjiang, the Uyghurs out there. That's an international disgrace,
right?
You basically have concentration camps of Muslim Uyghurs out there. That brings a lot of bad press. You've got another wave of COVID where they had to lock down Shanghai for God knows how long. By the way, it's just the largest port in the world. A lot of the shortages that we're having in the United States is because that stuff's built over in China, and nothing's getting out of Shanghai right now.
Yeah.
Like you said, you've got this increasing standard of living, and you may have 400 people in your middle class, and let's just say you have, nice round number, 10 million in your upper class. Well, guess what? That still leaves 700 million who are living below the cut line.
Yeah.
And so it's going to be interesting to see what happens with China, especially if they get into, it's going to be interesting to see what happens with us. If this economy really starts crapping out, it's weak right now. It may get weaker, probably will get weaker.
Right.
And so what happens when you don't have good times in China?
Yeah. Yeah. And also those 100-year plans, you get locked into those things and they get really problematic when it becomes outdated. I mean, if you had a 100-year plan and you weren't planning on drones 25 years ago, oh boy, you're in trouble. We were crashing drones in Bosnia, right? They'd go up, they come right back down.
Dude, they had drones in Vietnam.
Yeah, right.
We were using drones in Vietnam. This is not new technology. It's more reliable technology. It's more effective technology, but it's not new technology.
Right.
And it's people just need to pump the brakes and stop the threat inflation and really start looking at what's going on with the Russians and the Chinese. To me the Russians invaded because I think Putin was wise enough to understand this was probably the last chance for Russia to secure their near abroad.
Yeah.
And it's interesting looking at Galiev stuff. Again, he's much more of an expert on Russia than I am. But looking at Galiev stuff, he claims that all the easy Russian oil deposits are now gone.
Mm.
That they are now, basically they have to go up into the Arctic and they have to go into deep Siberia where it's super cold and it's super expensive to actually develop those fields and maintain them and keep them running. Well, guess what they found in 2014 in the Sea of Azov? A boatload of oil and a boatload of natural, and even more than natural gas.
Yeah.
Right. And so if you have an economy, and again, the Russian economy is small. If you have an economy that's basically built off of fossil fuel profits, and all of a sudden your fossil fuels aren't easy to get any longer, and it's more expensive for you to extract them and transport them. Well, you know what? I can just drive 100 miles and secure the Sea of Azov, and I've got another 20 years, and by that time I'm dead, and it's somebody else's problem to figure out.
Yeah.
I mean, really, that's what I'm being glib about it, but I'm sure something like that passed through Putin's mind. He's like, look, I'm 70. He may be sick, he may not be sick. Certainly doesn't look very good. But from his perspective is maybe this is the last great shot that we have.
There's a couple other things too I want to talk about before we get out of here. And in all of these cases, I would say if you can get 2,000 people with murderous intention in the same room walking towards the leadership of any country, good chance you'll win. I mean, like right now, if there were 1,000 dudes outside of the Kremlin, let's say that Putin's actually there, you're not stopping those guys. You're not stopping 1,000 people because you've got 100 and not all of them pointing forward, right? So it doesn't take much to topple a government, especially when you've got 700 million people that want to have some upward mobility. It can turn on a dime. And the other thing, well, let's just talk about that, like the ultimate, like how fragile a government can be, especially if the economy does go bad. It doesn't take much to turn to have, like, if a battalion if a battalion-sized element shows up on any world leader's door, what are you going to do about it?
Yeah, I mean, and that's the interesting thing about Russia, right? Where geography actually works in their favor, because Russia's so huge, it's hard to actually mass people, right? So if you take a look at Russia, their two most prosperous cities are St. Petersburg, which is on the border of Finland,
right,
and then Moscow, and everything that surrounds Moscow. There's a ring road that goes around Moscow. All the rail lines come in and out of Moscow. It's the central hub, so you can consolidate that relatively easily. But to your point, this is one of the things that was interesting to me is when those reports came out about 6 to 8 weeks ago about Putin starting to arrest a bunch of intelligence officers and senior generals and relieve them and sack them and arrest them. It's like, these are people who are loyal to you. And I get it. You're sending a message, but that message has two sides to it, which is,
sure does. Yeah.
You know what? I might be next.
Uh-huh.
Right. And I really don't want to be next.
Yeah.
So I think the longer this goes on, absolutely the risk for some sort of political change at the top of the Russian elite is going to occur. But like everything else, it'll be something that we can't predict or forecast.
Sure.
It'll be something out of the blue.
And maybe the next guy ain't the guy anyhow. Like that. How many times has that happened? And we're like, we got a new guy. Oh shit, the new guy's worse.
Well, where you get what happened at the end of the Soviet regime, where you have, who is it? It's Brezhnev, Chernenko,
and Andropov.
And Andropov. I mean, all three of these guys, there's three rulers like in 4 years because they're all in their 80s.
Yeah.
Right? It's like, so do you really want to put another 70-plus-year-old guy in charge in Russia?
Right.
Which is interesting because if you take a look at like a lot of the peripheral states, like the Baltic states, Eastern Europe, even down into the Caucasus, their governments are much younger. I mean, the heads of their government, their secretaries of state or finance, their defense ministers are all in their late 40s or early 50s. So you still have this gerontologist approach to leadership,
right,
in Russia, which has led to problems in the past.
Yes, it has. So really quickly, my buddy Eric Kleinsmith and I, who I don't know if you've met Eric or not yet. He's in our little email group that we have, but he was my commander in Bosnia. They're writing a book about our deployment because the 165th Delta Company was a company of counterintelligence agents and interrogators pushed forward. And for the first time that either of us can think of, an intel asset was the tip of the spear. It wasn't tanks. It wasn't infantry. It wasn't any. It was, and if we weren't out going forward every day, we couldn't accomplish that mission. That's just a fun thing to say about that book. But he and I were talking about the role of NATO and the fact that we deployed with Russia during the Bosnia deployment, and we're going to deploy Russia again. At some point, we're all going to have to get past all this, so we can't just cancel Russia forever. And the final note on this is, if Finland and Sweden and Ukraine join NATO, we know that there's going to be NATO troops in Ukraine on the border of Russia, and quickly Russia starts to say, hey, we're going to dig our heels in, and we're not going to allow this because they don't want, just like Iran doesn't want to be surrounded by a bunch of enemies, neither does Russia want to have to deal with a bunch of NATO forces on their borders.
Yeah,
but
so
that's probably what's going to happen.
Yeah, I mean, the sequencing of this is going to be tricky, right? Because it everything you said is absolutely valid, right? And what's coming to my mind right now is there's a piece that's going to be brokered if Putin is in charge. still, and then there's going to be a peace that's brokered, and Putin's not going to be in charge.
Right.
And the peace that can be brokered with Putin not in charge is probably going to be more acceptable to the West, where you can talk about things like, hey, let's bring Russia into the fold in NATO.
Right.
You know, which, by the way, I think was offered a couple of times in the 90s and rebuffed. But you're right. You know, when you take a look at Swinland.
Can I say this one thing? I got to jump in real quick. I went to I spoke at a NATO 70th anniversary conference where we all wrote papers, and there were Lithuanians in the room, and someone asked that question, when will Russia join NATO? And the Lithuanians damn near exploded into flames. They're like, what in the fuck are you talking about? Like, So even if that did happen, can you imagine the chaos of that? Okay, I'll let you go back to talking.
No. So look, right. I mean, it goes back to people in the world outside the United States have long memories.
Yeah.
Right, when you have the Soviets putting their boot heel on your throat for 40 years,
yeah,
and actually longer than that with the Lithuanians, you're talking about 3 centuries, Baltic states in general. Yeah, so you have all that animosity. It's still there, and there's distrust.
Yeah.
You know, with Finland and Sweden, I don't think Ukraine's going to be joining NATO anytime soon. I just don't. Even when this war concludes. Again, it's going to be interesting to see what happens because in my mind, there's a separate peace with Putin and without Putin. Because if you have a peace without Putin, you might be able to put like a bunch of troops in there for phase 4 ops, right? Where you secure the borders, you do patrolling, you start reconstruction, you know, all the stuff that we were supposed to do in Afghanistan. Maybe, right? With Putin, you're probably not going to be able to do that. He's not going to allow that to occur. And the thing with Sweden and Finland is if they move too quickly, and I'm pretty sure the NATO leaders and the political leadership in Europe is very cognizant of this, if you do this too quickly, it's going to escalate this even further, you know, because there's a very thin line between what Putin's Russia is willing to accept and what they're not willing to accept. Now, there's things that they're not going to be able to do about it, but you're just creating more animosity, more resentment. And again, like I said on your show a while back, what you don't want to do is create a bad peace, which just leads to a more destructive war 5, 10, 15 years down the line. Right? Because we saw that in the 20th century.
We sure did.
World War I and World War II.
Yeah.
So, you know, these are difficult topics to explore because a lot of it has to do with who's in charge of every country. You know, it's funny. I was talking with my dad this morning. He's like, "Hey, did you see that the Germans and the French still aren't willing to commit to shutting off the Russian fuel?" And it's because Hungary's holding out. And he's like, "Why don't they just do it themselves?" And it's like, I don't know.
Yeah,
they don't want to make that political decision.
Yeah. Yeah. And they've been trying to get along for hundreds of years, right? Or for as long as there's been years. And so there's stuff in there again that just not for us to know, you know. I mean,
exactly.
Yeah, I bet you could line up the Poles, Estonians, Latvians, and all of Lithuanians, Latvians,
Estonians, Poles,
and all get those guys, all of them, to give you chapter and verse 100 years of atrocity from Russia, right?
Sure.
And not for one instant like want to ever accept anything from Russia because there's just so much hate.
Yeah, I mean, I saw something yesterday. It popped up on my Facebook feed about it was one of the women who was actually a fighter in the Warsaw Ghetto.
And
she died at 106. Right, and it's like when you still have people alive who can remember what happened, it makes it really hard. You know, when you have a whole generation of people, because look, 1989 is not that long ago.
Yeah,
it's only 30 years. So you have millions and millions and millions of people who remember when you had to go to breadline number 6 to get your daily bread. And they don't want that to come back. Right? And that, you know, it's funny because, you know, a lot of people I talk with in DC get really, really mad about Hungary and really mad about Poland and why can't they be more Western? And I'm like, you don't understand history. You know, Poland has been stomped on for so long, whether it's by the Germans or by the Russians, that now they have freedom, like true freedom, to build their own way. They're not going to follow the EU lock, stock, and smoking barrel.
Yeah.
Right? Because there are things that it's not advantageous for them because they've seen what happens when you get too deeply ingratiated with with a regime that's not necessarily favorable to you.
I want to go back to Taiwan for one more second, then I'm going to
Sure.
let you enjoy the rest of your day. Let's say that China manages to get across, I don't know, that first battalion of people. Then what? I mean, you're gonna have to slaughter people to make them comply.
Yeah.
And again, like that's just gonna bring hellfire against China because that's going to be reported. It's going to be seen. It can't be kept secret. So if they do happen to get across, like they do an air insertion and they drop in a couple of brigades and half of those guys survive, it's going to be Massacre City.
Yeah, I mean, it's right. Again, these Marines, air assault troops, airborne troops, special forces, these are your shock troops. And like you said, with modern communications, this stuff is going to come out. It's going to come out very quickly.
Yeah.
And so, like when you form these lodgements and you try and sustain these lodgements, whether it's amphibious or airborne or air assault, and the thing with Taiwan is, there's not a whole lot of maneuver space in Taiwan. It's like mountains and coastal plain, and on the coastal plain, that's where people live.
Yeah.
Right. So it's going to be interesting to see what would happen there, but it's going to be bloody. I mean, this is a little bit of a curveball here, but that's one of the things that I'm going to start looking into a little bit more. Is I think that we're entering. We may not be there yet, but we're pretty close. I mean, you really need to start thinking about this seriously. Is the predominant way of war won't be in rural areas. It'll either be suburban or urban. And that's going to require a much different approach to how you man, how you train, how you equip, how you fight. Because it is a much different ball of wax when you're trying to fight in a city of, let's say, 7 or 8 million people that's got 80-story high rises,
oh boy, yeah,
10-level subterranean parking garages, and underground cities like Crystal City in DC or Northern Virginia, where they have an entire shopping mall built underground. It's like, think about how you have to fight and sustain. What kind of troops do you need? You're going to need engineers until they bleed out. You're going to need all sorts of. Because here's another thing. I remember talking with a buddy of mine who just came out of Engineer Battalion Command. Most major cities are built around what? A major river system.
Yeah, yeah.
So if you start dropping bridges, like I was thinking about this in my hometown of Philadelphia. It's like if I drop the Walt Whitman Bridge and the Ben Franklin Bridge, and I drop the Betsy Ross Bridge and the Tacony Palmyra Bridge, there's not a bridge within 50 miles. And if I drop those four bridges, how do I get people across from New Jersey?
Yeah.
And that's just one river. Philadelphia has two. It's got the Delaware. That's the Delaware what I was talking about. And you've got the Schuylkill, on the other side of the city. So you need bridging assets. You're going to need construction assets. You're going to need demolition assets.
Yeah.
Incredible.
Could you imagine, like, if you, this is John Spencer's territory, but we've talked about this. Like, if you had that 80-story building and you could bait that trap enough that you could talk a commander into going up into that thing, and then you just drop it on him.
Or you land on top of it and go down. It's the same thing. If you can drop it, you've just lost, X amount of troops, right?
Yeah. 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 I mean, whatever it is, right? Like that mega city fight, it is.
And we saw this in Mosul, right? When we retook Mosul from ISIS. Mosul, ISIS had actually booby-trapped an entire city block. I mean, think about that for a second.
Yeah.
An entire city block has been booby-trapped.
That's crazy.
How do you clear that?
There were parts of Mosul that we didn't want to drive through because we knew we would just get hammered, and not in a way that we could do anything about, And this was in 2004. Now imagine what you could do with, the democratization of combat.
Yep.
You can just go through this horrible hallway of hell to get from A to B. And then, now you have to stand there with drones capable of coming overhead, and you're trying to clear, you're trying to be like the sapper or whoever's going to come in there and clear that thing out. Oh, good grief. Yeah, impossible.
Yeah, it's nuts.
Yeah.
I think that's something we really, and you're right, John Spencer really is the expert on this, but it's something we need to take into account a great deal more, because even something as simple as like armored weapons, whether it's tanks or infantry vehicles, your main gun on a tank only has a certain level of elevation, right?
Yep.
Maybe you have to put like a ball turret in it, right? Where you can get full max elevation.
Yeah.
Right. There's tons of ways to look at this, right? It's just one of these things that I think we're whistling past the graveyard, thinking that we're going to be, driving across, Northwest Europe and the lush, hilly fields of Germany.
Right. I mean, I want that kind of fight too, because that means I'll be in a cafe drinking hot chocolate mitsana with the mayor, doing what I do. You're right.
You'll be in the barrios down in Rio.
Oh, that's probably true. Yeah. Wherever there's some fun and some tequila or something to be had, that's exactly where I'll be. All right, man. Listen, we've done an hour and 15 minutes. I appreciate it. Always fascinating. Tom's right. This is a super fun and interesting interview. Anything in closing before we go out?
No, not at all, man. Just tomorrow's my last day in the Army after 26 years, and by God, it's time.
Yeah, it is time. Well, now we're gonna write some papers and cause some hell and say you should have done it this way, right?
Well, I don't know. We'll see. I'll definitely be writing, that's for sure.
Good. All right, do that, please. All right, stand by. Everybody check out Andy's stuff on Medium. Dziengeleski. I'll put the link. Actually, the link is in the comments. Look ahead. All right. Hey, thanks for watching the show. I really appreciate it. Right here, you can subscribe. Please do that. It makes the show grow. Hit that notification bell so you know which incredible guest is coming up next. Down below is the PayPal link. You can put a small subscription in. That is an enormous help. All that money goes right back into the show. And then right up over here are the next episodes you should listen to, curated by yours truly. Thank you so much.